Okay, well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to this reserve session 4, R4, of the Borough Planning Examination. Okay, this session is concerned with housing supply and is follows session 5A, which looked at housing supply. That's an overview of the housing supply situation, and at that time further evidence was requested from the Borough Council in relation to their evidence of windfall supply, the annual housing trajectory, and evidence to support that trajectory. And the Council has supplied that extra evidence, and there have been some written statements also in response to the further evidence. And more recently, the Council has provided a further amendment to the trajectory following changes recently being proposed during the examination at Lenham, Staplehurst and Yalding. So, just a few housekeeping matters. In the event of the fire alarm sounding, please exit down the stairs that you came up or via the alternative staircase. It's just through a door in the room beyond that first staircase and assemble at the front of the building. Last, any mobile phones are switched to silent or turned off whilst we're in session, please. The session is being broadcast by webcam, and the camera is above the entrance door, and it's linked to the microphone. So I'd ask that when you speak directly into the microphone, and ensure that the red light is on when you're speaking, and turn it off when you finish speaking. And only one microphone can be on at a time, apart from my one. Okay. So there hasn't been a formal agenda for this session, although a letter was sent out inviting the participants from the other session back to this one. And as I said, there's some written statements have been made in advance of the session. So we'll deal with the matters as they come up. Firstly, just to explain, I think initially the recent changes to the trajectory the Council's only put in a few days ago. Perhaps I'll just ask the Council just to explain those for, I think, the benefit of those who may not have seen the papers.
Thanks, sir. Good morning, everyone. Perhaps just a bit of a recap, starting at April this year, so that everyone is absolutely clear on where we do stand. We submitted on the 1st of April a topic paper, which was part of our overall local plan submissions. 1st of April remains our base date for the purposes of our figures and calculations. Then 1st of September, we provided an informative update, ED 013, on progress and additional gains which were made in the last 5 months, including things like building control completions and such. The attempt here was to illustrate that the target remained realistic. Syngenta was removed from the list, and it included a ring around, which we did to try and update some of the sites. We attempted to show how that would affect phasing, and also provide an update on progress for allocated sites as well, where, for example, Section 106 status had changed there. Then we provided, which is ED 43A, in November, the supplementary data tables. These showed inclusion of Lenham, Lodge Road and Staplehurst, and also updated situation in respect of Syngenta. So we provided 3 schedules from both the March and a further ring round in September, but April still remained the base date. So therefore, no new sites were provided apart from the Lodge Road in Staplehurst as a result of the neighbourhood plan. There were 3 sites in that where we applied a cap, and we also included the feedback from developers, so we reduced another site down from 75 to about 50 units. And then on Friday, we submitted a modification to ED 43A, to the November data tables. That was a modification to the 1st of April base date, removing Syngenta altogether, the change to Lodge Road in Staplehurst, taking it down from 90 to about 50 units, and also the rephasing of Lenham was included as well. So that's where we're at now. So hopefully that brings everyone up to speed.
Okay. Okay, I want to look, I think, first at the windfall development evidence. Now, the National Planning Policy Framework allows that the Council can include windfall in the 5-year housing land supply if compelling evidence of such sites have consistently come available and will continue to provide a reliable source of supply. There will be, there are already windfall consents which will be extant at the 1st of April 2016, so they can be delivered in the early years of the plans, particularly the first 3 years. And the Council, based on its 1st of April start date, allowed for delivery from small sites from the year 2019 at 48 dwellings per annum. So that avoids double counting with the extant permissions in the 1st of April. That means there are only 2 years of that small windfall supply in the 5-year housing land supply, which is 96 dwellings, 2 years at 48 dwellings per year. And the sites on garden land are excluded in line with government policy, although there is said to be a contribution of 28 dwellings per annum additional, which is not in the 5-year supply. Now then, it moves on, so that looking at the later years of the plan, the Council then adds in larger sites, and so adding the larger sites to that 48 dwellings per year from smaller sites. Means that from the year 2021, then the supply rises from 48 to 116. In other words, that's 68 dwellings per annum from larger sites. And the Council goes on to assume that until 2026, when it goes up again to a figure of 185 overall windfall contribution. So that, as I take it, it's made up of 137 from larger sites and 48 from smaller sites. And as I understand the Council's argument, they're saying that the reason, first of all, there's the issue of including larger sites and whether that's the correct amount from 2021. And then the reason for it going up again, as I understand it, in the later period, is the Council is saying that there are, at the moment, essentially, there are sites in the earlier period would have been identified and allocated in the urban capacity study and likely to be fed into the supply already. But there are kind of unforeseeable sites in the later period at the moment which haven't been brought out in the call for sites and so on, because we're talking kind of 10 years ahead, and landowners can't be expected to know what their intentions are that far ahead. So they wouldn't have suggested as allocated sites, but by the time you get close to that, the presumption is if there's been a review, then you start to feed some more into allocations, but so they're to drop out the windfall allowance, so they've been put in windfall allowance for the time being. Okay. The Council's confirmed that it's calculated that average windfall between 2008 and 2016, well, 8 monitoring years, said that in that period, the windfall from larger sites, none of which are on brownfield land, was 136 per annum. and that's said to exclude sites identified in local plans, urban capacity studies and SHLA assessments, and to exclude town centre prior notification consents for office to residential conversions. And as I understand it, that figure, that average figure from large sites of 136 has then been discounted by 50% to come up with a 68 per annum figure from larger sites. Now, okay. Could you just explain how you've come to how you came to that 50% discount on those? What is being excluded, or?
Yes, certainly. Yeah, the reason for the 50% discount in years 6 to 10 is based on, similar to the small sites, that we'll still have some extant supply in effect during that period, plus also a lack of sites that we could effectively identify due to the SHLA process and the urban capacity studies before that.
On the, so you said that you've excluded town centre prior notification consents, but does that include other windfall in the town centre?
It's just prior notifications that have been excluded from the town centre, so other outline and full plans are in the windfall allowance, yes.
Right. So there is still an expectation, well, I say a discounted expectation, but that if that's carried forward, then is there still then okay, some of the windfall is still in the town centre, because I think at the previous session, I think that it was raised that I think it was stated at some point that the town centre windfall was going to be excluded from that, but the figures show that some of it is included. Mr. Edgerton.
Yeah, just to clarify the Council's position in that regard, town centre is included in respect of future windfall allowance. There is no double counting in that respect, because our town centre broad location deals with specific allocations. Those allocations are not included and are not affected by the overall windfall that occurred to help inform future year windfall, so the previous windfall. The previous windfall is both small and large sites in the town centre, dealing with that specifically. But I think it's fair to say that the vast majority of sites are from small sites in the town centre, conversions and so forth. So the two are effectively exclusive in that regard.
Sorry, could I amplify that, Mr. Mellor? The supply for the town centre, or expected supply, was set out in our response to your question. Sorry, I've given a very long answer. You're in your question 5.3 in session 5A. There's a table set out on page 12, paragraph 5.3.21. How the 990 town centre broad location total is derived.
Is that one I bought? Yeah, I think what you're showing is that, as discussed previously, that the council came up with a series of sites from which it thought the broad location will be derived. And this was I think, was originally, was it 2,500 or something for the total thing, and then you brought it down to the sites which are actually included in as more certain to come forward or more likely to come forward.
Including office to residential prior notifications,
Yeah. Okay. Right. And then, so there are the town centre. Well, the past supply. Obviously, the past supply. We've had larger sites in the town centre, and for the just to work out though, if you're carrying forward an allowance, part of the windfall allowance is still expected to come forward in the town centre, and this is other than broad location sites then, because you've got a broad location figure allowance for the town centre, and then you're carrying forward 50% at least of past delivery, including some town centre sites, into the future.
Yeah, just to confirm, so you're absolutely right. The broad location allocation sites, as referred to in the Council's response in 5A, they are exclusive. So we do have a windfall allowance for Maidstone Town Centre within the town centre boundary, comprising both small and large sites, but they are exclusive to the allocated allocations for the broad location.
Can you say of the if you do can you say what the contribution you're expecting from the town centre in the future is to windfall? Is that aside from broad location? I mean, what
I don't think we've broken it down specifically into the town centre as to the amount of windfall that would come as a proportion of the overall windfall into the future. We have done some sort of initial analysis which indicates that the town centre does have quite a high proportion actually of these small windfall sites compared to the borough as a whole. So the distribution, I mean the initial work takes into account the first couple of years, and the distribution is relatively as we would expect. There is a scattering of windfall sites, both small and large, across the borough throughout the countryside and outside of the urban areas. Then there's a greater concentration in Maidstone overall, with the greatest contribution being within the town centre itself.
Okay. Ms. Bedford.
Thank you, sir. Just a couple of points of clarification, really. I feel a little bit aggrieved about the fact that we spent last week, a couple of days, very short notice, scrutinising a set of figures, and then find ourselves a couple of days before the hearing looking at another set of figures. So I'm just trying to clarify exactly what the Council's current position is. So we're going by the statement that was published at the start of this week, which I believe the Council's position is that it can show a 5-year supply of 7,068 units. But it'd be useful to actually get the figures in our mind that we're looking to get.
So just say that figure again. Good.
So I'm adding up the years 1 to 5 of the new trajectory, which has been published this week, which I think gets to 7,068. So I think, first of all, just a point of clarification, are we working to the right figures here? Which is a jump up from...
That's the figures. It's in the Council's statement, which accompanied that table, table 5.1. That's the figure, the total land supply, 1st of April 2016 to 31st of March 2021, 7,068.
So that's the 5-year target.
Yeah.
I'm just conscious that, say, we spent a lot of time last week scrutinising the last set of figures, and now we find ourselves another set of figures that we just simply haven't had the time to scrutinise or properly get to grips with. Okay, I'll have to come back on the other points shortly. Thank you.
Right. Mr. Cooling.
Thank you very much. The first point I'd like to make is we've all had to absorb these figures very quickly. There's been a weekend in the middle. The coordinating team is unpaid, volunteer. We've managed to absorb them. But I think the context for this is at the last meeting we heard that planned windfalls, well, the expression was an oxymoron. But we actually, I think, then recognised that doing our best to plan forward based on historical evidence is what is professionally expected. And I'd be surprised if any of the enterprises represented on this side of the table, apart from me, I'd be very surprised. No doubt their strategic plans are in position, but any of their development plans going forward over several years, I doubt that they're worth the paper they're written on roughly a year or even 6 months after they're put together. The world moves on. These projections, and the coordinating team is heavily critical of the borough, but these figures are at best, I'm going to say, guesstimate. They will be wrong, but they're the best guesstimate. And getting back to windfalls, which I think is where we've started, it was like drawing teeth from the borough to get them to recognise any windfalls. An element of the coordinating team, before it came together, Calc, pressed and pressed with letters and representations, and eventually windfalls started to appear as a subject matter. They're still woefully inadequate given history, and the allowances that are made are way below what could be allowed. The historic figures from KCC going up to, I think, 2007-8 looked something like 275, 300 a year. And by the way, windfalls still appeared after the last. It's still the approved Local Plan 2000. So there will be windfalls even after this is approved, and we contend that it will be way above the level that the borough has been dragged to actually recognise. And there can be no argument for this 50% phasing. Even last year, in the Council's recent in document EDO 43A, Appendix 1, there was a figure of 125 for, I think it was 2015-16, and you may have had the chance to spot, amongst all the paper you get, that the coordinating team believes there may be errors in that, which, when corrected, would add a further 30. But we may have misunderstood the situation. But we applaud the Council endeavouring to project forward. They will be wrong by definition, but we believe they'll be wrong on the cautious side as far as windfalls are concerned. Thank you.
Okay. Mr. Jarman.
Yes, as Mr. Cooling was alluding to, obviously the further you project into the future, the more difficult it is to have certainty over this. As I understand it, the development industry are basically saying in a post-adopted local plan world, there won't be hardly any windfalls. It'd be great if the world was as absolute as that. But what we've done is we've looked back over the past 2 years, from the 1st of April 2014 to the 1st of April 2016, and I can give you this information, sir. But it falls into a number of categories. It's mainly residential intensification. Obviously, Maidstone is a large town, and it's quite an affluent town as well. It's got a big rural hinterland. So a lot of our windfall within those 2 years was, dare I say it, knocking down a single large house and building a few more. On very large houses, it was conversion into apartments. What I call intensification. As I said, I think the viability is clear in a town like Maidstone. So those sort of intensification, relatively small windfall sites, I can see continuing into the future. And dare I say it, the development industry fully engages, usually in the local plan process, at a fairly high level. I think there will be sites of 15 or below with the best will in the world will not come forward in a call for sites exercise. And also looking at windfalls as, you know, the public estate rationalises. There's examples of windfalls where now not needed student accommodation has been redeveloped for houses, where the public estate, the land is just too much, it's surplus to requirements. There's lots of pubs being converted into residential. I could go on, but we came up with 102 windfall sites. And broadly speaking, I see those trends continuing into the future. I tend to agree with Mr. Coolin. I can't absolutely say it will be X number over the next few years.
But those sort of intensification sites, so locking down one house and building several, isn't that excluded under the Greenfields land exclusion on here? That's part of your 28 per annum, isn't it? That's a good point. It's conversions as well, but it includes both. They tend to be knocking down at least one or two houses rather than just building in the back gardens. It's what I would refer to normally as sort of backland development, infilling, that type of intensification. Okay. So is that included in that then? You've included that as brownfield sites rather than excluding them as greenfield?
Given that there is a large proportion, conversion of large dwellings to flats and redevelopments of existing residential and so forth, absolutely, they're considered to be brownfield.
So the ones you've excluded then, that's the adding a house and a garden, is that? Yeah.
That's correct, sir, yes.
And just to be clear, this recent exercise was all about projecting windfalls into the future, where the likely sources of supply and types of application and locations.
Okay.
I have got a map with me of the geographic distribution of those windfalls. Mm-hmm. And as one might expect, it's dominated by development in Maidstone urban area.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Mr. Stevens.
Thank you very much, sir. My attention was drawn to the Cabinet report of the 28th of January 2015. Originally, in my representations, I queried the evidence basis for the windfall allowance. Having been drawn to that Cabinet report of the 28th of January 2015, in which the Council set out its position for a windfall allowance of 880 dwellings for the last 10 years of the plan, I thought that was a very reasonable allowance, and I thought that was quite a conservative estimate by the Council. I don't think 1,600 is unreasonable either, except that I am slightly troubled that it's suddenly doubled. To me, that suggests that the Council is trying to fix a 5-year land supply position. That might be a somewhat cynical perspective, but it does seem to be a bit troubling. My chief concern, though, and we did discuss this previously, sir, is the potential of double counting of the Maidstone town centre, broad location and windfall. I think the local plan does need to provide absolute clarity. I think you need to separate that out. I don't think you can count really any windfall within the Maidstone town centre. That allocation was increased anyway from 700 up to 900. And that corresponds to the figures for the broad locations that are now set out in the updated trajectory we have, which is very useful and very clear. But I do think there needs to be separation, because I'm just thinking down the line in an appeal situation, I think the council would need to be quite clear about its sources of its land supply in order to come up with a good defence. So I am slightly anxious about that. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just wondering how things are going to be counted in the future. If you're saying in the future, if it's a question of what is going to be counted against the broad location allowance, I think. If you're saying broad location allowance is based on identified sites, which means that only if those sites are delivered, well, only if there's deliveries on those sites, then do you deduct it from the remaining broad location figure. I'm just wondering if another way of doing it might be to actually say that the broad location is not the whole town centre. Yeah, the broad location are those identified sites. You don't know how much. You can't say specifically we can allocate that site for 100 dwellings because that's what's going to happen. Because you haven't got a scheme yet. Say for a site like the Mall or something, you don't really know what the final mix is going to be. But so you have an allowance for all the sites cumulatively. But instead of saying that, well, the whole town centre is a broad location, we're saying that these are the sites which are going to contribute to the broad location. And then that makes clear that if you get some other delivery on different sites, then that's a separate matter. And that can be windfall, that can be another allocation or whatever.
Sorry, I agree with you, sir, and Mr. Stevens in terms of the need for greater clarity on this issue. It's just, obviously, as I'm thinking, what we've basically said in the broad location about sites is that they're indicative sites. Mm-hmm. Obviously, that's different to our allocations. And obviously, we're including an amount of office to residential prior notification, and also on top of that, we a smaller element, but we should be including retail to residential as well. Sorry, sir. In your suggestion, did you mean actual allocations, sort of red line sites?
Well, yeah. I mean, if we went down that route, then you'd have, I think it had to be a red line because of some sort. I don't see there's a way of saying that. But it's something short of an allocation, it seems, because you're not saying that this. You're saying there's going to be this is site's going to be changed. I suppose it's a little bit like when you're saying that okay, we have a kind of core strategy. We're going to have an area action plan in this area, and that'll work out exactly exactly where what or exactly what the mix of development is, for example, on that site. I mean, broad locations shouldn't be identifying supply that's going to come forward within the first 5 years. And there was one concern on the trajectory now that you have got some figures under broad locations in the first 5 years. And I'm not sure if the figure, I think, is that the Lenham site or something? Yeah. Is this one of the Lenham appeal sites?
Just to confirm, yes. The broad location figures now that are in the first 5 years are from Lenham. And in terms of the town centre broad locations, they don't start until year 6, 2021, 22 monitoring year.
Yes.
I'm just,
Yeah.
sorry, sir. Just looking at the clarification we provide in 5.3.21 associated with the submission and the identification in the town centre of those sites. And I know that only a proportion of 45% of the identified sites is assumed to come forward. And I'm just wondering, I'm thinking about your point around, there's a difference between allocating those sites specifically in isolation and looking at those sites as a whole, and whether or not I would just wonder whether or not there's a potential there for a sort of master plan to deal with it, which would, as per Lenham, absolutely, which the route which we're going down there, it would seem consistent that we deal with that approach rather than dealing with the sites in isolation, saying they have to provide a certain and have that contribution.
Yeah. Yes. That's like, so there wouldn't be a figure per site. There would still be a town centre figure, but the broad locations would be a series of however many sites it is, 6 sites, 7 sites, or whatever, or something. And say, from within that, we're expecting the delivery of this much housing from within those sites. And by the time you get to review stage, you ought to be able to position that you can actually be allocating them anyway. Okay.
And perhaps clear up Mr. Stevens's point about double counting.
Yes. And then it means then you can still allow that there are going to be kind of these other small sites, conversions, adding flats on tops of shops, and the sort of things that go on in town centres. And it would be clear that that's a different matter. This isn't part of the whole kind of broad location supply. Okay. Any comments on that suggestion? No? Ms. Cooling.
I think it sounds eminently sensible. The only qualification I'll put is I think it's 900, or is it 990 for the town centre, being, did you say 45% of the candidates? You would expect me to say that sounds rather low, and hopefully there could be a bit of refinement on that at this early stage, but I absolutely agree. Then pouring more concrete into that at the local plan review is absolutely the way forward. I do have another comment on something that came up a few minutes ago. Should I hold that back now?
If you could just a moment, please, while we bottom this one out. Now, it means that, for example, then, if you get, say, delivery on another site, which isn't in one of those broad location sites, and I mean, if we go back, for example, Baltic Wharf was in the wider potential supply, but not in the 990 in the evidence you gave before. So within 5 years, you may be in a position that there's some supply coming forward on a site like Baltic Wharf, in which case that would be a windfall if it happens in the first 5 years. If it happens after review, by then there may be an actual agreed scheme of some sort, and then there may be an allocation. But it's clear that is not part of the board allocation. It would be something additional. Okay, Ms. Cooling.
Perhaps there's a refinement on your suggestion. Only by very quick inspection, there are very, very, very few windfalls within this list that are what I would call very significant numbers. Mm-hmm. So perhaps you may play with the concept that if any major unexpected application comes forward, then it actually counts towards this overarching, is it urban allowance. Mm-hmm. So if I'm making this up as I sit here, if a site which is not in the candidate list comes forward and may well give rise to 50 or 60 or 70 houses, then I think I might be the first to say, boy, that is a bit more substantial than a windfall, and that it could come into this other concept. So the candidate list may be that, but other big ones may come in and contribute to that 900. Then I would say the 900 or whatever it is far too low a percentage for a candidate list. That
yes, they wouldn't be contributing to the 900. They will be contributing to the large sites windfall if they came forward. And I mean, and there's an expectation already of this large sites windfall, and as Mr. Stevens just talked about the 1,600 overall in the planned period. And that some of those sites would be larger sites, you know, the fairly significant sites. And you need some of those, otherwise, to justify that allowance.
But if I may, if this concept for the town centre is going to be restricted to 900, which is roughly 45% of a far bigger figure, then this adds to our argument that the windfall allowance is far too small, given history. And by the way, the origin of the 880, that was after the borough, the MBC, had been buffeted, bludgeoned by particularly Maidstone Calc to actually contemplate the windfall concept. And that was the first tentative step, and it was pretty crude in terms of 10 years at 88, if I remember rightly, and I think it was 35 small ones and 50% of the bigger ones to give the other 50, whatever it was. It was crude, and it has been refined. It's still wrong, and it's still far short of where it could arrive at. So the 880, the fact that it's doubled, we applaud that, but I'm sorry, it probably needs to go up another 50% at least.
Mr. Munson.
Thank you. Just a short point. I still got a concern over this windfall allowance, particularly one that increases over time. Made the point at the last session. If we're excluding town centre and having this approach we're talking about, which seems sensible, we're left with relatively small sites. Now, the brownfield sites have been developed in Maidstone now for a good 10 or 15 years. These sites are finite. The council will be very aware of a lot of the windfalls, brownfield sites. It just seems difficult to believe that number is going to increase over a 15-year period. Of course, in terms of windfalls, looking at past history, we are talking about a period where there hasn't been an up-to-date plan in place. Mr. Cooley made the point that, looking at the supply at the minute, we are talking about a low number of small sites currently. So it's just looking at those facts and then looking at an increasing windfall allowance over a period, given what's happened in the past.
Yeah, I mean, the increase allowance, I think, as was said earlier, relates to what's going to happen kind of beyond 10 years, and that's the issue is whether there are sites which, at the moment, perhaps is a business chugging on quite happily and expects us to go to for the indefinite future, and then 10 years time, economic circumstances have changed. There's no demand for that product, or it's a garage that wants to move out, or something has happened, very fundamental. And I don't see how the council can necessarily predict what's going to happen beyond 10 years for sites like that. I mean that's where the source of supply would come from.
Sure, but then should we be over predicting at 185? It's just.
By the time we get to there, at the view stage, there's another call for sites, and those sites may come forward. Then they switch to the allocation at that point, and maybe then you have your allocation for the remaining plan period, and you don't have that step up necessarily in the windfall allowance because it's moved again another 5 years on. Okay, Mr. Jarman.
Yeah, just to add to that, as I said earlier. Large parts of the town of Maidstone are made up of what people refer to as suburban areas. They will become more intense as time goes by because they're viable propositions. I mean, you see this in virtually every London borough. You know, businesses go to residential. You see greater and greater intensification of residential areas.
Mr. Bedford.
Thank you. Just to clarify our position, really, I don't think we've ever suggested that there shouldn't be a windfall allowance included within the plan. Quite clearly, sites will come forward that weren't planned for. But I'm just amazed about the scale of the unknown that's included within the plan, and the fact that 2,590 houses for the town centre are expected to come forward on unidentified sites, and there's absolutely no contingency in place if they don't come forward. It's too much risk, and then when you put that on top of the broad locations, the other broad locations and other speculative elements, I think it's just too much of the plan has been left to chance. And considering we're in a position where it should be positive plan making, I'd rather see the council in control of its own destiny moving forward. But that's why we felt that the potentially not relying on windfall sites for the first 10 years, or until the last 10 years of the plan period, would be a better plan to actually allow the council to produce credible, up-to-date information based on new evidence once an adopted plan's in place. But again, just to clarify, we've never suggested windfalls won't come forward. We just think there's too much reliance on them and not enough flexibility.
Yeah, can I just ask a few points arising from your statements? Because you said that you doubt the 1,600 allowance overall, and you say the supply of brownfield will be exhausted. And you've heard back to previous statements about town centre windfall being excluded, which we've discussed. And you said that the evidence is not robust and a cautious approach is needed, and there are three options available. Progress with the windfall allowance and delete the 990 broad location figure as one option. Define the town centre broad location area and provide amended windfall figures to exclude past town centre delivery. I'm not quite sure on that point. I mean, the town centre broad location at the moment is defined as the whole town centre. So it's sites within that. And what we're now talking about is kind of refining that to say that it will be defined as particular locations within the town centre. Doesn't that deal with that point about other town centre delivery then? Because the past town centre windfall delivery can continue outside those identified locations.
Yes, to a large degree, I think to me, what we're looking at now is identifying the town centre broad locations as areas of opportunity, or however else other plans refer to them. But I think most instances, areas of opportunity aren't relied upon within the figures because there's no certainty that they will come forward. I think, I'll go back to what I've said at the original session, that if these sites are deliverable and actually likely to come forward within the plan period, they should be allocated. But if they can't shown to be deliverable, you need to take a cautious approach and have a contingency in place should they not come forward. And essentially that's our position, is that at the moment we're maxing out the windfall, taking everything possible based on old data, and I personally just don't think those rates will continue after the adoption of a new local plan. I think a lot of the brownfield sites have been exhausted via the allocations process. And not only that, I don't think there's any certainty that the 990 would come forward. I would personally have no objection if the council were to go one way or the other. If they wanted to rely fully on the windfall allowance, then I would suggest that the opportunity areas, the broad locations, continue to be identified, but I wouldn't rely on the 990 units within the housing supply. Likewise, I think, I would take if the 990 were going to be included as a core element, I would probably take a more cautious approach in case windfall sites don't come out at the rate that they're expected. It's purely just I would rather be in control of a destiny and take a cautious approach rather than, say, put too much risk on what happens if the town centre doesn't come forward and be delivered in the way that it might have done in the absence of an up-to-date plan.
Okay.
Thank you.
Mr. Cooling.
2 points, if I may. It strikes me the 990, and I said already, we think that's far too low a proportion. That is trying to estimate the known unknowns, i.e. these sites are known by name, they're not known in detail, but they are known candidates. Windfalls, by definition, are an estimate, a guesstimate of unknown unknowns. And by the way, we've been told that the source of such windfalls may be finite. Well, I'm ex-oil industry, and I remember back in the mid-70s there were reports that the oil was going to run out by, I don't know, by now. I've looked back at a KCC document, and it is old, but it actually shows the history going back to 86, 87. So if this source is finite, boy, it has been going on for a lot of years, and there is no reason to assume that through the inventiveness of developers, big developers, small developers, that opportunities will not come forward for windfalls at the historic rate. Thank you.
Yeah, that's one thing more thing I want to ask Mr. Bedford, because you calculated a 22 dwellings per annum figure for 264 windfall units, and say that I think that's based on rural areas. So that's everything outside Maidstone, is that? Yes. Am I saying you suggest that there should be no windfall allowance for Maidstone and only for the rural areas?
No, I don't. I think again when we had the first session, the council's evidence, as I understood it, and both orally and in writing, was that town centre sites were excluded from the allowance. Yeah. It wasn't a case of town centre prior notification. There was a quite clear statement. So what I did was I was just trying to emphasise that if that was the case, then the windfall allowance is much lower if you take away the urban area. I'm not suggesting for a minute that windfalls won't come forward in the town centre, because clearly they will. But I think the problem is it's such an unknown source that I suggested maybe we had a rural windfall allowance, which I think are more likely to continue at a steady rate because policies haven't particularly changed for those areas. But the town centre I would treat a bit more cautiously. I'm not sure I have the answer here in terms of what's the best way and what's the best balance. Clearly some sites will come forward in the town centre, but my honest view is I think it's far too high at the moment.
Ms. Cooling had a couple of specific queries about sites in the windfall and how they've been treated. One of them was it Harbleton House? If we can find that on here. So the three sites. There's Coombe Road, wasn't it? Coombe Road, Harbleton House, and land south of Wallace Avenue. Were I think Harbleton House, I think you weren't criticising that one and saying that was about the right figure, but it's pointing out the contrast between that site and the Coombe Road site.
Apologies if we have got this wrong, but it looks odd. The first two are on page 2 of EDO 43A, Appendix 1.
So we can find this.
Sorry, but we appreciate how negative may arise in the calculation, because especially if a couple of old houses are knocked down to put 22, 25 new ones in, but to have a net negative just stood out. We probably just don't understand it.
Let's find it. Coombe Road, I found it. Yes, it's minus. So it came out as minus 65. And you thought it might be a net gain of 43.
That's how it reads. But again, apologies if we're wasting time here.
Yeah.
I know Coombe Road well. It used to be Maidstone Borough Council council houses. Then Golding Homes Housing Association basically got ownership of the estate. And it was a redevelopment of that estate. And there's a net loss because there were a large number of flats which were in a pretty poor condition, one of the main reasons why that estate was redeveloped.
So flats replaced by houses or by...
Partly, yes. Yes. The ethos behind Golding Homes' redevelopment was to improve the estate. The flats, I think, were built in the 1960s, and they were, in the main, replaced by houses.
Right. Yes.
We can only go by what is on the NBC website, and to describe the application, I won't read the whole darn thing unless you want me to. It says demolition of 122 existing dwellings, brackets including 18 two-bedroom houses and 104 three-bedroom houses and so on. So demolition of 122 and the erection of 112 houses together with 52 flats. So agreed that a lot of houses are being demolished, but it seems that more are being provided.
Okay.
I think I can help out here. So, these are snapshots, so they're taken in a specific period of time, and development goes through phases. So one of the first stages of development is the demolition of the existing units. Now, we then take our snapshot, and if that coincides with the demolition, for that reporting year, it will be a loss, and then the additional units come forward in the future years.
So that will be a boost to the following year. So the windfall profile, by definition, is not flat. Is not a flat line. It goes up and down. But I will stop at this point. But it does seem odd, not almost at this point, that 125 is characterised as a total for this year. Surely it would have been better to forget the negatives and just look at the positives, and the negative be swept up in the year when the net result comes in.
I hear what Mr. Cooling is saying, sir, but the fact is that sometimes development proposals are modified. We get resubmissions and so forth and clarification following demolition. And so I think it's realistic just to take the information we have at that time.
But if I'm sorry to be difficult, but for that particular year, the net is given at 125. In fact, that hides the fact that the number of positive windfall, the number of windfall other sites put in was way above 125 for this representation of a negative, and there's another representation of a negative. So forget the negatives, because those sites have got to mature, and you'll put the net figure in whenever the net figure comes in. But for all the other sites, it looks to us as if it was about 165 or something.
I mean, the sites themselves are still relevant, sir. We do, unfortunately, have a net loss once demolition has taken place of residential units. I won't say.
Okay. Well, I don't want to get too deep on this thing. We've got it's one of the bigger issues, I think, on this. Was the land south of Wallace Avenue, is that a similar situation? Yes. Yeah. Okay. Okay. It may be just semantics. So I wonder if if reference to an opportunity area might be an alternative to broad location. I don't think it matters very much in terms of semantics in this case.
Just thinking this through, sir, I mean, generally for an opportunity area, it isn't necessarily the case that sites have been identified. The purpose of the opportunity area particularly from a London context with which I'm familiar, is that the general area itself is considered to have potential. What we've done here, and what I'm trying to square away, is we have identified sites at this stage, so there is a greater degree of certainty than potentially an opportunity area would indicate, and maybe, you know, illustrating it through a broad location with the potential of a master plan to take things forward is appropriate, but we'll defer to you on that one, sir.
Well, I don't think you need. I think it just confused matters to suggest it's kind of a different policy or something entirely different. Though, as you're just carrying forward and refining something that's already been proposed, I think that's stick with broad location. But as action point, then, the council will consider how to define those the areas which were listed as previous evidence, so that to give them an area basis. And obviously, you know, some of them are mixed developments, and so they are likely to include other things anyway. But okay. I'm just wondering if actually where things are on the Maidstone East site. It's almost another site like the. The actual amount of certainty as that's what's coming forward there. It actually doesn't seem any greater than it is on some of the other broad location sites in terms of, you know, if it's going to be housing, there may be some offices, maybe food store, may not be food store. It's become more vague as things have gone on.
Yeah, I was just checking. It is within the town centre boundary.
Yes, outside the shopping area, within town centre, isn't it? That's it. Yeah. Okay. Right. I think to move on then to the actual trajectory. So from that windfall. So the new evidence provided in November was the housing trajectory to allow for the annual identification of the sources of housing supply, and then some written evidence to support the inclusion of sites in that and their phasing. And to say that's being refined with this more recent version put in this week, although the changes are relatively small between those two. Now, one of the I'll do first the matter raised by the coordinating team, because they're concerned that the trajectory concentrates delivery in a what they describe as a surge in the early years of the plan period, and I think their concern is that would create another kind of what they previously called a spike in delivery. And as I understand it, your concern is that would then be carried forward in future housing projections, and with an expectation that it created a consistently higher rate of need in subsequent periods. And that's your concern, I think.
Absolutely, and hopefully not being too adversarial. If we have borough members, borough officers, who really want to grow Maidstone for whatever reason, and is it because of the new homes bonus, and is it because of council tax accruals, then that would present an open goal for them when it comes to local plan review, because it will look back probably at just the last 5 years, and hey presto, those who wish to develop, and also the Office for National Statistics will project forward the implications of that spike, i.e. population increase, and I'll use the word exponential, though that's obviously mathematically wrong. There will be an exponential spike that then will give rise to a next spike, etc., 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 because Maidstone will be playing catch-up on an ever-increasing annual housing requirement. Thank you.
Mr. Stevens.
Conversely, I think we feel the trajectory is quite sensible in terms of an emphasis on front-loading as opposed to backloading. I've seen too many local plans which backload, which rely upon large elements of supply, usually in rural areas in the southeast of England, delivering towards the end of the plan period. And I think it's sensible that you front-load or have as flat a trajectory as possible in order to ensure that you've got some guarantee of meeting your overall housing requirement by 2031. Otherwise, there is a problem, there's a potential problem of having requirements, annualised residual requirements, which just get too big towards the end of the period. You'll understand the point, Inspector. I don't need to explain it to you. I think the point made by the gentleman next to me, I think, is to distort or to misunderstand the purpose of the planning system, which is that projections, household and population projections, is all that we've got really to rely on in the basis of planning for future housing needs. In 1947, we intervened in what was the eminent domain, the ability of people to develop their land as they wanted. The state intervened, deciding that it would be a more efficient, more efficacious way of planning for the nation's needs. And in doing so, in withdrawing, taking away that individual right to develop their land as people saw fit, the state is under some obligation to plan for future housing needs. And the only tool that we have is household and population projections. I think it would be quite cynical to say that you should deliberately distort your housing land supply by backloading just so that you could then influence the household projections. I think that would be I think that would be quite an immoral approach, actually, to planning. The state has asserted that it will plan better than the market, and the market left its own devices. Therefore, it is incumbent upon the state to come up with a system of planning for housing needs. And unfortunately, the only tool that we have is census data and household projections. I take the point that there might come a point in time when Maidstone Council says that we're full up, we've done our bit, and that there's no longer any capacity left in Maidstone without causing some sort of environmental or landscape damage. And therefore, Maidstone Council can then use the duty to cooperate to say that somewhere else, Ashford Council possibly, or somewhere else, should deliver more homes. But we're not in that situation at the moment. And Maidstone certainly hasn't chosen to use that planning tool so far.
Okay, Mr. Cooling.
First of all, you don't look old enough to have been practicing in 1947, but please, that was...
I'm a historian.
You're a historian. Oh, that's good. I tend to read a lot as well. I don't know where to start, because this trajectory is actually front-loaded because there's another parameter in play here. It's called the 5 years housing supply. And if it wasn't for that parameter, then I would absolutely agree a flatter trajectory would be appropriate. And by the way, perhaps not a flat trajectory, but a trajectory that started off lower and ended up higher to actually reflect gradual growth. But as far as statistics are concerned, absolutely, we have to... Professional planning has to be based on a numerical approach to life, certainly in this arena. And Office of National Statistics does a good job, but if you actually look at the variation for given geographical areas between one issue of ONS stats and the next, there can be extremely, extremely great variations, and I believe there have been within Maidstone. And surely it is absolutely right, when you're looking at statistics, to actually look for, are there anomalies? And the Maidstone's anomaly has been about the past spike. And by the way, in the Guildford Society argued extremely successfully with ONS that because of their large student population, etc., etc.
Yeah, we had this argument before, and I think we established we haven't got a large student population, so
I don't know whether a colleague on my right has heard that, but the ONS does adjust its statistics, and therefore our borough should have argued for an adjustment based on past anomaly, because the spike gives rise to exponential growth. So corrections need to come through. And by the way, the duty to cooperate is just that. It is a duty to cooperate, which the coordinating team does contend hasn't been applied. But by the way, it's not a duty to agree. So if Maidstone's need, and by the way, the need has been built on for affordability, so it's an expanded need, we can talk, and we could and should talk to Ashford, and particularly Tunbridge and Malling. That hasn't happened, but it doesn't mean they will agree. The problem is we have far too high a need because statistical corrections have not been applied in professional planning. Thank you.
Okay. I mean, a number of representations just made in the latest statements are, I think, if I summarise it, I was saying that there are the questions about delivery on various sites, and some of these were also raised in the statements to the previous session. And we'll come to some of the forward location delivery later, but on the allocated sites, it seems that the main effects of those criticisms of delivery is if they're correct, is that delivery would slip from the kind of the first 5 years to the second 5 years or beyond that. Essentially, either extending the period for delivery on particular sites, or saying that sites won't start as early as suggested, or it'll take longer for them to get going. Which might have the inverted effect of kind of flattening out that curve to an extent. There is another question, which is about how the backlog is dealt with, because we're in a position where there has been under-delivery in the first 5 years against the current needs assessment, so that what's it, 2,500 or something, 2,800, I think, of delivery in that first 5 years, instead of what would be, nearly 5,000 or something if it's been delivered at average rate. Government guidance is that you should seek to deal with that backlog in the first 5 years where possible, it says, which is usually known as the Sedgefield method. And if a different method had applied, then it might be spread over a longer period, and it wouldn't be part of you wouldn't need so much in the 5 year supply necessarily. One of the occurs to me, because it does. You look at the curve, the company's trajectory. I don't think it's on this paper. It's on the previous paper. And it's quite dramatic that you have this very steep increase from this low rate of past delivery to a very high amount. It's kind of essentially a tripling of the annual housing rate, pretty much, in the early years of the plan period. And then it falls away, so that towards the end of the plan period, you've got much lower rates of delivery. And I think that delivery in that latter part may be even lower still when we start looking at particularly the Invicta site, so that you end up with this quite an S shape to delivery. And I wonder if there is considering how that might be a bit flatter. I question some of the realism of managing to deliver that many houses onto the market that quickly in the same area in the early part of the period, and then leading to a period when the later part of the plan period there may be, the supply may be seen to be too low for the demands, having built that up. What effect would it have, for example, if instead of applying the Sedgefield method to the backlog, if you applied, well, I'm not going to say Liverpool method. The Liverpool method deals with backlog over the whole plan period. That has its own problems because you, apart from the fact that you're delivering houses many years after the shortage was first identified, But if you do then don't deliver them towards the end of the plan period, it slips out the plan period altogether and you're way ahead. I don't wonder whether there's a compromise between those two positions in that you, I don't think it has a name, so maybe call it the Maidstone method of dealing with the backlog over the first 10 years instead of the first 5 years. So it's still dealt with before the end of the plan period, but that might be an opportunity to flatten that curve a bit, but also to acknowledge that I think delivery on some of these sites at this rate may be more, some of the allocated sites may be difficult to achieve that increase in such a short period. Yes, Mr. Jarman.
Broadly speaking, we think the Sedgefield method is the correct approach. For two broad reasons. I think for a long time there was what was referred to as a moratorium on greenfield sites. So there was a long period of over 10 years, when housing companies couldn't build family estates, from want of a better term. So I think there was that latent demand. On top of that, I think we've got a very pragmatic plan in terms of housing. We're not like Ashford Borough in that we're concentrating on two very large sites with very long lead-in times. I think we've got very pragmatic, deliverable sites, which has been proven by the fact that planning permissions have been granted and a large number, an increasing number of our allocations are being developed out. The three sites we talked about with regard to the transport sharing along the A274, people are living in those houses now.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Mr. Stevens.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Yeah, generally, we're supportive of the adoption of the Sedgefield approach by local authorities, even where they have got a good track record. Maidstone is a local authority which has a good track record against the South East Plan targets, as I think I said in one of the previous sessions. But I mean, the council is right that it has had the effect of the moratorium on greenfield development has resulted in quite a lot of pent-up demand in different locations in the district. And I think it's important to analyse the composition of the housing land supply that supports that trajectory. I think USA would possibly have a valid point about whether that spike, as it's been characterised in the first 5 years, is realistic if the council was relying on a lot of strategic sites coming forward. But in fact, when you look at the housing land supply, it's actually quite a diverse portfolio of sites, small and medium-sized sites as well as large sites. And that a diversity of sites, and this is a message that we are talking to the government about at the moment, a diversity of sites, big and small, across a district area is a very important key to sustaining delivery. So we're generally supportive of the Sedgefield approach and also the what appears to be a front-loaded trajectory. I do have concerns about the Invicta barracks at the end. I do think there could be a sudden fall-off in the last 5 years, but I think that's an issue to park for the moment.
Okay. Ms. Cooling?
First, an observation which I'm sure cannot be taken on board, but I think it's a bit unfair for the borough to be characterised as having had such a huge shortfall in the first few years as depicted on this trajectory, because at the start of that trajectory, this plan and its scope and the objective assessed housing need was nowhere near a conclusion. And to actually say that Maidstone Borough Council failed to meet its need is unfair because the need at the time was far lower. I can't remember, it's 500 and something if I remember rightly.
Well, that's not the need. That was the requirement. That's the
Sorry,
distinction. We had this discussion previously that the need hadn't been assessed. That was the problem.
That's
the local need.
Absolutely correct. Whereas the perceived need at the time, as judged by the previous plan, was far lower. So, firstly, it strikes us that the backlog is unfairly represented. Then, as you quite rightly pointed out, this trajectory with a huge front loading. And by the way, there is a concentration in one part of our borough, and we've heard about the infrastructure issues. So we've got front loading, we're racing ahead, infrastructure issues, particularly roads, will not be resolved within the first 5 years. We've heard from KCC that they're in dispute with the borough, and therefore a review in 2022 is critical, but this is almost shutting the door after the horse is bolted. It looks extremely uncomfortable. It's the pace of change that's uncomfortable as well as the absolute height. So any ideas you have, such as the Maidstone method, that would mitigate to a certain extent that trajectory, but it is still a heavy front loading. But I understand why, because the other parameter of 5 years housing supply, whether it's the Maidstone method or whatever, is actually forcing the borough to front load. Otherwise, it will not have a 5 years housing supply, and then protections will be somewhat more limited. So the methodology imposed by government of 5 years housing supply is forcing it on the borough, but it's an unfortunate methodology, and it's going to have implications because of infrastructure constraints. Thank you.
Okay. Can we look at some of the specific criticisms of sites and delivery which come up with, which have been brought up? Right. Let's see this. Okay. I think, I mean, Mr. Bedford, I think you came up with a number of sites in your previous statement, and I don't think we've actually dealt with those as yet. So looking at. I've not got this. I don't think I've got it with me now. Okay, Pastor Mr. Bedford, if you just go through the sites where you say that there's a problem about delivery, either because the evidence, the council's evidence is suggesting that the site may not come forward or not in the form that's supposed, or that the delivery won't be at the rate that's expected.
Yes, thank you. Just before I go into this, I'd specifically say we have deliberately tried to stick to the sites that either we are directly dealing with, so we know all about, or have very good knowledge of. So I think first we addressed the... so there's various different sites with existing planning permissions where we just think that the sites will come forward slower than what the council envisages. Modern Cricket Club in particular.
Can we identify these on where they are on the trajectory, and then might help.
Yeah, so modern...
Is it, just can I just ask, on the trajectory, is there a particular order these set out? Because I couldn't see that there's a recognisable order in the way that which the sites have been put in here. Is that by date of admission or alphabetically, or... Right. Okay, right. Right. So we think, sorry, the first one was what again?
Okay, so going back to our original matter 5A statement.
I just called it up on my laptop.
Yeah, and it was the critique that was appended to that document.
Yeah. This is in your the recent statement or the one for the 5A?
So it was our 5A statement, original 5A statement.
Okay, that's fine.
And then to that we appended a critique.
Yeah, I think I've got the one. It says Marden Cricket and Hockey Club. Is that?
Yes, that's correct.
Yes. Okay.
Again, this one's a pretty straightforward position. Having detailed discussions with the developer and clients who are dealing with the site, we just felt that assuming that the whole 124 units would be delivered within the 5-year period is particularly over-optimistic. There's lots needs to be done in terms of replacement community provisions and what have you. So we felt that 80 units was probably more realistic, based on what we've been told by the developers.
And that was minus 44.
Sorry, yes, minus 44.
Yeah. Okay, so the council will respond to these sites as we go through them. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you, sir. We had a pre-application meeting on this site just in the last 2 weeks. The replacement sports facilities are expected to be in place autumn next year. But however, the developer is talking about bringing forward an element of the development on a part of the site that isn't sports land, and we're in discussions of that phase coming forward earlier. And that, as I say, that's just in the last 2 weeks, and that was a discussion with the agent and Countryside developer. So you're able to, I mean, are you saying that you still can all be delivered in 5 years, or is another figure? I don't want to put numbers on it. I think in the area that could come forward, that is the higher density area at the back of the site with the affordable housing and the smaller units. So I feel that is still realistic if that phase comes forward earlier, and indeed the restriction in terms of the sports facilities is just at the end of or autumn next year. Okay, Spafford?
Yeah, again, as the agent acting on behalf of the developers, as we say, there is a need to go in for a new permission, and we think that will take time. And certainly, we're of the view that it's probably still a bit too optimistic for all of those units to come forward.
Mr. Chairman, yes.
Mr. Bedford's representing Countryside, but is Mr. Bedford's argument that the council is going to be part of the reason for delay because he's assuming that the application will take some time? Is that the point? What counter evidence you're putting forward?
Sorry, just to be clear, our evidence is that having detailed discussions with the developer and their programme of when they're expecting deliveries to take place and to come out of the ground and to be available for sale, they feel that it's an over-prediction. So they feel that units will come forward, probably 80 units within the 5 years, and that the rest would nudge over that period. And again, I'd say I appreciate there's a degree of unknown here. So all I'm doing is relaying what's been told to us directly by the developer. But it's not, we're not insinuating that the council will drag its heels or again, just an up-to-date assessment of what the developer's telling us.
Is this different from what the developer told the council in the, is it referred to in the schedule of sites? Was there a different comment? If I find it. Is this list not in any order either, or is it... Which H1 site is this? Or is it not an allocation? H1 47? Well, it's not listed in this schedule. I can see, unless it's something it's in order.
It is referred to in the housing topic paper ED43, so the 2016 supplement. It's on page 30 of that document of ED43. It's the row 1 from the bottom.
Oh, yeah. Cannot start on site until September 2017. Completion rate of 3 dwellings per month. 36 in year 2, 2017-18. 36 in year 3, 36 in year 4. Remaining year 5. 16 in year 5. Okay.
That information does have a March base date, March of this year, so it hasn't been updated since March.
It doesn't. I'm just wondering what. But the start date didn't seem to have changed, does it? The 2017 start date was still what's being referred to, so that hasn't slipped. If it's 3 per month, if you start in September 2017, you've only got half a year in the first. You've only got 6 months delivery, so you'll be 18 down. But in the last year, you're only expecting to deliver 16 anyway, so you put the 18 in the last year, and you've still got that rate of delivery. You still have the total in 5 years. Okay. All right. So it doesn't seem. I'm not entirely convinced that that's going to slip that much. Next one, Landor Farley Hill, Toville.
Again, this is a site that we're not actively involved with, but we've been approached by a number of developers to comment on and to look at in detail. And our understanding is that the developer, or any developers that have previously looked at this, have pretty much all dropped out once they've done their due diligence because of severe contamination and wider constraints. So, again, we can't provide any more detailed evidence than that, other than the original planning permission. I think dates back to 2010. I think from memory, the reserve matters application has been taken forward by the landowner again to try and get interest in the site, but to date, and so on my last understanding, was that there simply hasn't been possible to get a developer signed up.
Mr. Chairman?
Yeah. This particular site, I think the origins go back to the 2002 urban capacity study. I'm sure I can't contradict Mr. Bedford in terms of actual housing company interests, but the landowners have known about the contamination for well over 10 years. And I'd be amazed if they haven't done any due diligence exercise.
So I think, again,
That was expected to start when, that site?
Yeah, so this, again, in reference to ED 43, this is now page 31 of that document, and it's, again, it's the second row up, and we acknowledge the fact that there's no developer on board at the moment.
So we're expecting to start in 2018 with 50 per annum. Okay. So it seems that there is at least a risk on that one, but of starting later or...
Yeah. There's a lot. It's a lot of the land has been cleared already. It's not a sort of a contaminated site that hasn't had any work done to it because, like I said, it's got a long history.
The longer the history, the less, the more doubt it throws on it coming forward. But, okay. All right. Okay, next one. Land between Millbank, Alcombe Road and Kingswood Road, Headcorn.
So you'll be well aware of this site probably from the Headcorn sessions. It's the disputed land, I think, as the participants call it.
It's one with the judicial review, is it?
Yes, yeah. And I think the latest challenge, I think, as I understand it, the objectors have sought an oral hearing, so that rumbles on. It's clearly still in outline form. Need detailed reserve matters to be, judicial review needs to be got out of the way. Then we need to get reserve matters in, and we just again felt the delivery is possibly a bit too over-optimistic on this one. Again, we're not saying that the site won't come forward, but we think the full allowance within the 5-year period is probably unrealistic, so we suggested a cautious approach and took 75 off of that.
How do you calculate 75? Is that sort of our latest start date, or?
Yes, it was a later start date, and I think we estimated 50 dwellings per year coming forward as an annual rate.
I mean, if it remains in the plan, the judicial review may or may not succeed because it's on a procedural matters relating to the environmental statement, as I understand it. So that the third challenge, okay, right, okay. So, I mean, potentially it could mean another, have to determine another application on the site with an environmental statement if that was the way the court went, I suppose. So that's the date on that. Okay. And the trajectory is assuming that starts when?
Well, the reference here, so in ED 43 is page 33. It's the bottom row of that page. 31 dwellings to be delivered in year 3, which is 2018-19, with 31 dwellings to be delivered in year 4, 2019-20.
So that, right. Is that changed from previous ones? Because Mr. Bedford said it would be 75 fewer dwellings, but that's only 62 expected in the...
So I think this is part of the problem we've been having with the difficult trajectories, because not working to one base date, all of the different numbers are coming forward at different times. So I think it does differ from the topic paper, which was the evidence, the latest evidence before us when we put that submission in.
Are you working on no delivery at all in the 5 years, or...?
So the topic paper, when we drafted that, assumed 125 units coming forward within the 5-year period and 95 being delivered within the 21-26 period. And we suggested that we essentially suggested 50 units within the 0 to 5 year period. So one.
I'm only saying 62, so there's not much difference. Is it?
So, but again, I think that's where the figures are. There are probably some broad agreement now.
Okay. Okay, so there isn't much difference between them on that one.
No.
Right, the Garland House. This is a site which I think is this the free school site?
Yes.
And should that come out of if that is going to be free school, should it come out of the trajectory?
So just referring to the Council's own evidence, there's a clear note that Kent County Council are now intending to develop the site as a free school. So that's one of the queries why, and that's a pretty clear statement that it's not going to come forward. And if it is, it would need to be subject to a new consent once that free school use is introduced.
Okay. I'm unaware of any notification from Kent County Council confirming that.
Is this a free secondary school, or is it a primary school, this one? This one, there was a...
I'd have to check.
No.
Yeah, just to clarify the actual context of the telephone ring rounds, they're informal chats with agents and developers, so it's not a formal notification process. So in terms of the feedback we had on the school site, they're indicating that's the direction they're going in, but we haven't formally been notified of that position.
Okay. Okay, well, it's only 14 houses. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that one. Right, then we've got to come on to the sites where you say there are unrealistic assumptions regarding the phasing of the emerging allocations. And the first of these is H110, land south of Sutton Road. Now, the council is assuming, I think, was it 50 in the first year and 85 per annum thereafter. And you're suggesting a different figure. So that's the figure. Okay, where's it gone? Yes, no, the trajectory is suggesting 30 in 2018-19, then 85 per year after that, completing in 2029. And I think, Mr Bedford, this is your client site, and you're suggesting only 50 per year from this site of 800 dwellings, which would take 16 years to develop this site, which seems a very long time, and not consistent with your evidence on your client sites at Lenham, where you say there could be up to 80 a year on a site in Lenham.
So I'm struggling to find it in the latest trajectory, but essentially we're still...
It's on page 12 for the latest one.
Yeah, sorry. Again, I'm going... Sorry, which page was it? Page 90. Yes, so the latest trajectory is assuming deliveries will start in 2018, 19, and then 85 a year. I think what we suggested was that it would start later on in the plan period, and that it was safe to allow for 50 a year. Again, I'm going by what my client's advice was.
I mean, surely on a site of that scale, you could easily accommodate 2 different house builders offering different products, which is usually a method of increasing delivery.
I believe it's solely in control of one developer. I don't think there's any intention to bring another developer on board.
So the one developer just wants to kind of dribble supply out on the site.
No, I think it's okay if we assumed. So again, it's struggling with the order of the paper and what have you.
I'm concerned here is that only 50 a year, you actually fall outside the plan period altogether at the end, because you won't be completing until 2034. And there are other factors in this. I mean, for example, I think I was looking at the contribution to the bus service. It was only a 3-year subsidy, and after 3 years, if you've only got 150 houses, it isn't going to be a very viable kind of bus service before the subsidy stops. And other matters such as, when would the payment come forward for the Junction 7 improvement? Because you can't wait until 2034 for that.
Yes, again, it's a difficult one to predict. So I gather that I have no further news in terms of when the outline permission in the Section 106 is going to be concluded. Again, it's not. Unfortunately, I don't have my colleagues here who's directly dealing with it in this session. But I'll say my understanding is that that's still pending. There's still then the need to do the reserve matters, to get the infrastructure in and start deliveries coming out. And we felt that it was an overestimation.
Mr. Chairman. So your microphone's not on. Could you turn off, please?
I'd just point out that there's a site next door which has almost been completely built out by Taylor Wimpey. I'm not aware of any contamination or any major on-site infrastructure work, so I really don't understand Mr. Bedford's pessimistic view of things.
Ms. Munson.
Yeah, Mr. Bedford's reporting what he's being told by his client, but I would just point out that this is one of a number of sites in this location. Your point of more than one developer, maybe not, it doesn't sound like there is at the minute, but there are several sites with several developers already competing for sales in this location.
Mm-hmm. Ms. Cooling.
Projecting this far forward, as I think we've all said, is a very uncertain business. But I think we are viewing MBC as accountable for forecasts, because it is that entity which will be held to account if the borough ends up with a major problem. And in terms of risks, one of the risks, of course, for this particular site is the contest with KCC on traffic, which may still end up as judicial review. And if that is the case, that is one huge risk. So MBC is doing its best to put this trajectory together. We don't like the numbers, they're far too high, but MBC is the professional body that will be held to account. So, of course, many of the colleagues, not colleagues, friends on this side of the table will want to knock figures down in the early part. Why? Because the borough would then be forced to allow other sites to come in so it can meet a 5 years housing supply. This side doesn't want any windfalls in there. Why? Because it allows more sites to be put in and allocated. So I'm going to use the expression vested interests are very important to consider here, but it's the residents of this borough who are not. The coordinating team is doing its best, but it's limited. The residents are not being considered because the housing number is too high, the trajectory is far too front-loaded. We understand why, and this site in particular is one that really highlights one of the major issues with our infrastructure, which may still end up in court. Thank you.
Mr. Court. I don't think you're the court that he's going to end up in, but...
Thank you, sir. I've got a number of concerns about a dozen sites. I don't know if Mr. Bedford had finished or whether to interrupt your flow or how we play it, but I'm happy to comment on a number of points made by Mr. Bedford at this stage. It's really how you wish to play it, sir. Can I just go back to the Marden Hockey and Cricket Club and also another site in Marden, the Parsonage? The fact is, sir, that I don't have any problems with the availability and developability of these two sites. It is the timing of them, as Mr. Bedford said. And the reason that I am concerned that the Borough Council has overestimated the rate of delivery from these is that within Marden itself, there are several large allocations and permissions. There is the Marden Apple Pickers Depot, controlled and being developed by Redrow for 45 units. There is the Howland Road site for 44 units, controlled by Ryden. There is Stanley Farm for 85 units, controlled by my clients, Millwood. Those with the Parsonage and the Hockey Club come to 442 dwellings. Now, putting those together, the council is therefore thinking that if those are developed in 5 years, then there are going to be around about 90 completions per annum for a place like Marden. It's an attractive place, there is demand there, but I have concern as to whether the market for Marden could accept 90 units per annum. So I took my concern to a local estate agent who specialises in Marden and also Headcorn, which I'll come on to later, and asked him what, in his extensive experience, could be built and sold at Marden. And he said 90 was too many. He thought probably 50 to 60 a year. Now, as I say, I don't have anything against those sites. It is timing and it is an issue of market demand. And so I would suggest that the council has collectively overestimated the rate of development at Marden itself. Mr. Bedford also mentioned Farley Hill. I was looking at that site when I was with Persimmon Homes in the early part of this millennium, 2002 to 2005. What Mr. Bedford says is absolutely correct. I think many landowners have looked at that site and they've all turned away from it because of the contamination, and they were not persuaded at the time by the owner, who said he would decontaminate it himself any reputable house builder would want to make sure decontamination was undertaken to their requirements and to the council's requirements, rather than simply buy something where the owner had said, don't worry, it's all sorted out. So I fully agree with Mr. Bedford's concern as to that site. As I say, I looked at it on behalf of Persimmon Homes in about 2003, 2004, and here we are. It is still not developed. Mr. Bedford mentioned the Millbank Alcombe Road site in Headcorn. I would make the same point there about market demand for a village such as Headcorn. It is a pleasant, attractive village, I will say that, but again, I've looked at the totality of sites in the very latest trajectory, and there are 9 sites overall in Headcorn. A lot of them are small, but basically the council is forecasting 448 dwellings on large sites. Again, that works out similar to Marden at about 90 completions per annum. I spoke to the local estate agent, and he said again, he thought that was very optimistic from a marketing point of view. He thought that around about 50 to 60 in a village like Headcorn would probably be all that could be reasonably expected. It could be higher, it could be lower, we don't know. But at the moment, I'm happy to be guided by a local estate agent who knows both of these villages very well indeed. I would also endorse what has been said about the land south of Sutton Road. As Mr. Cooling and I were here on transport last week, we heard about the County Council's concerns about this and the threat, I think, of a judicial review. So I would treat that very cautiously. I'm not going to say it's not going to come forward, and I'm not going to say exactly when it will, if it will, but there is a huge question mark about that, sir. If the County Council is so concerned that it is considering a JR, then I think it would be very risky to accept development there, certainly in the short term. Those are my comments on the sites that have been talked about so far, sir. I have some other sites, but I don't really wish to interrupt your programme as to how you deal with them, because I don't know if Mr. Bedford had finished or not.
There's a few more on his list. Parsonage, Marden was one of them, and he's down as a -50. This is site H148. What was your reason, Mr. Bedford?
So, sorry, jumping straight to Parsonage, because there's obviously Laguna Motors that I don't know whether it's best to go back to the order that we were.
We'll come back to that, but just to Parsonage, because Mr. Court's mentioned it.
I think it was purely because of the reliance on the land next to it having to come forward first. Again, we've just suggested a more cautious approach be taken to it. I'm not sure I can add very much more than what was said within our statement.
Mm.
I think that the council again has amended its. I'm having real difficulty with the fact that we submitted evidence, commented on the evidence, and now phasing has been changed to adopt that, but we haven't got the ability to go through the whole phasing for the rest of the sites. It's very, very difficult. That's why you have a strict base date, and everything should be working to one base date in the interest of fairness.
Well, we're still on the same base date. It's just that it was still on the 1st of April base date. It's just that the evidence has caused some figures to be changed. Do you know what page that's on in the...
I believe it's page 30. So.
page 13, ED43.
That's correct, so yes.
Is that one gone? Message.
Yeah, fourth row.
Oh, yes. Yeah. 10 dwellings in this year, 50 next year, 50 the year after. Is that unchanged in the latest trajectory? Is still that's 10, 50, 50, is it?
That's correct, so yes.
So you just think it's a later start then, is it, Mr. Bedford?
Yeah, essentially, we don't think it's going to come forward in the 2016, or in the next... We don't think 10 units are going to come forward in the next 4 months, essentially, and start that early.
Yeah. So you say 74 before in the 5-year period and 50 thereafter. Is it 74? No.
We felt that was a better balance, yes.
Sorry, 94. Yes. Vigilance. Mr. Chairman, you want to comment on something earlier? No.
Yeah, it's quite a strategic point. Just to point out that between the 1st of April 2016 and the 1st of September, another 390 houses had been completed. So sort of Mr. Court's basically been negative about everything, and his latest one is to pick up on any risk, to push everything back at best. And his latest is some sort of saturation point because of a discussion with a local estate agent in Headcorn. And Marden, which are on very good railway lines to central London. But the plan is working. I'm sure Mr. Court doesn't like that, but it is working.
Okay. All right. Okay, we'll just do the last few of them, Mr. Bedford. It's Laguna Motors, H117.
Thanks, sir. Again, in honesty, it's a difficult one for me to address because this was one of my colleagues who attended the original session hoped to discuss. But again, my understanding was that there was significant doubt about the likelihood of this coming forward within the 5-year period. I know there's an application that's still pending, but in honesty, on this particular one, I can't offer anything more because I was relying on my colleague.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, as I understand it, the application that Mr. Bedford is referring to, which the council had for a number of years, has been withdrawn. And I know that Laguna Motorcycles have a retail development in Aylesford, Forstall Road retail area now. However, to cut to the chase, we have had very recent pre-application discussions with the owners of the Laguna site. It's in the adopted local plan. It's a site that we want to see housing on. There is an issue with flooding, but the site is surrounded by fairly recent developments whereby the first 6 metres don't contain any habitable rooms.
Yeah. It's not in the 5-year supply anyway, it's from 2022. Okay. Wrens Cross, H120.
Sorry, I've got ahead of myself. That was the site that I was actually referring to, Wrens Cross. But again, I don't think I can offer any more of an update. As I say, when we put this statement together, it was a collaborative approach, and I was hoping that we'd discuss it at the session where my colleagues that had the detailed knowledge of these sites would be able to contribute. But in the time available, I simply just can't provide any more update other than we felt that there was specific reasons why this site is unlikely to come forward within the 5-year. Again, we're not necessarily questioning its inclusion as an allocation, but certainly my colleagues were concerned. They didn't think it was realistic that it would come forward.
I mean, the comment in the schedule is that in March 2016, the agent said that work will commence once the application has been approved and site completed by 2017. And now it's in the trajectory for 60 dwellings in 2018-19. And the implication of what you're saying is there won't be any delivery at all within the 5 years. As you said, minus 60, which is all that's expected anyway.
So yeah, all I can say is that my colleagues assured me that there was significant constraints about the site, which is why they didn't feel it could come forward. I've not had the opportunity to go through that anymore in the last week or two, and quite frankly, I can't come back to you anymore, I'm afraid, on that one. But
yes.
Sorry, sir. We did refuse an application previously. And obviously there were then discussions which led to a new application. My understanding is that we're likely to permit that new application. It's a relatively small site. It comprises of listed buildings. I don't see any on-site problems at all. I'm sure Mr. Bedford's colleagues are referring to the fact that there's listed buildings, but that's the whole point of the application.
Okay, and last one, Hennon Ducker Staplehurst, H149.
yes, thank you. So this is addressed within page 38 of the Council's document of last week. And the developers clearly said that they would expect a year to discharge and to submit and agree reserve matters, and then commencement of development 18 months thereafter. So essentially 2.5 years before any delivery will take place, based on that 48 dwellings per year that the council relied upon. Essentially, we think the phasing has been done too early, having regard to what the developers said. Developers said that our clients have said that it's going to come forward starting in 2019, 2020, and say the notes here suggest 2017.
That doesn't seem to tie up with with what the developer said. Is that what, or is it the case that 1 year from reserve matters to be signed off within 18 months start to living? Is that 18 months including the 1 year? Or is that 18 months start after the 1 year?
Yes, just to give clarification, the way I interpreted that feedback, it would be 18 months from when we did the ring around in March time of this year, so 18 months for the start.
Okay. Just ask if the reserve matters has been submitted. Obviously, again, this is a March base date. You know, we're 6 months on. Had the
Well, the current status of the site is it's at Section 106 status, waiting for that to be signed off.
Okay, so it hasn't got the outline permissions yet, so you haven't got the reserve matters application yet. Okay.
So I understand there's quite a few outstanding issues with the Section 106 agreement as well, which I don't think it's particularly imminent that it's going to be signed.
It is imminent. All the matters have been covered now.
So let's say, if it's imminent, so it's signed, within the next few weeks, then just the year to sign off reserve matters. So that's the end of that'll be the end of next year to get to that point. And first delivery then would be in 2018-19. It's 6 months after the reserve matters. That does suggest that there won't be delivery in 2017-18. Yes.
It just needs to be bearing in mind that the phasing of this site was interpreted as of March of this year, and
yes.
as we go through the year, for example, getting to the sign off the Section 106 has become delayed. So we tried to build in flexibility within the phasing of the site, but if it does slip, then that's something we would review at the start of the next monitoring year.
Okay. And Syngenta, now that's come out because the council's taken that out. The trajectory as that allocation is likely to be deleted. So, okay. Right. I'm just going to let's have a short break now because we've been going without a break, and let's look at what matters we've got left to deal with. So there's a few more sites like this that people want to raise, and then. Matters on the 5-year supply and the board locations still to cover. Okay, so we'll just take a short break now and start again at 20 past.